Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for the start of our 2021 virtual Kansas Safe and Supportive Schools Conference. My name is John Calvert. I am the director of the Safe and Secure Schools unit here at KSDE. Want to start off today by thanking you all for being here. Go Chiefs. Let's go and run it back again in a couple of weeks. We can do it. I hope you guys didn't party too hard last night and you're ready for an amazing keynote today. A couple of quick notes. Thursday's keynote from Brian Mendler titled "That One Kid" is going to be pushed forward to 8:45 in the morning instead of 9 o'clock. So again, that'll be 8:45. If possible, enable your video if you feel so inclined. I know that will help all of the presentations this week, all of our breakouts, all the keynotes. If you enable your video so we can see you, I know that will be amazing. I will continue to place my contact information as well as my cohort Jim Green's contact in the chat in case anything happens this week that you need to get in contact with us. Feel free to drop us an email and we will get back to you as soon as we can. And also, as we go out into this week for our conference, when you're talking to your colleagues or if you get on social media, make sure you use the hashtag KSSafeSchools. So that everybody knows what you're talking about, and get the word out that you are taking your time to attend this virtual conference. Without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right into Adam. Adam Holden is the executive head of the Albert Einstein Institute in Panama City, Panama, and a doctoral researcher with the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, where he has led a team of researchers in developing an educational application to provide high quality professional development for teachers in developing countries. Adam has been a university and K-12 educator in both the private and public education systems of Europe, North and Central America for more than 30 years, where his institutional leadership has twice earned the coveted National Blue Ribbon of Excellence Award. In 2015, Adam received the President's Volunteer Service Gold Award for voluntary service and education in the area of educational technology. Adam is a highly regarded international speaker on digital innovation and education with keynote engagements in Asia, Europe, and North and Central America in recent years, as well as 2 recent TEDx presentations. In recent years, Dr. Holden has developed a nationally recognized 21st century education model in one of the most advanced educational campuses in Panama. As a result, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit the country, Adam was recruited to join the Ministry of Education Advisory Committee in Pandemic Management and was named a special advisor to the Minister of Education for online and digital learning. In his role, Adam has spent the last 8 months leading multiple pilot programs used to define the parameters for the virtual operation of all public schools and has led a team reviewing the national learning guidelines for the country. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Dr. Adam Holden, for joining us this morning.
Thanks, John. Let me share my screen so that you will be able to see the presentation. So hopefully you can see my opening slide now. Give me a thumbs up if that works for you, John. Great. So great segue from John. So let's start with the most important part of the day, which is to congratulate the Kansas City Chiefs. There aren't too many die-hard Chiefs fans where I am, but trust me, we were screaming for everybody yesterday. And as John said, not too thick ahead this morning, but enough to remind ourselves that we had a good day. So well done, Chiefs, and let's see them go in a couple of weeks. So, as John said, in recent years, I've been fortunate enough to be able to spend quite a bit of time looking at research, particularly educational research, and working with a group of professionals to try and convert that research into things that we might understand. And that's where today's presentation will come from. So I'm going to walk you through the research surrounding how to build healthy communities and to develop healthy cultures. And as a result of that, we're going to look at a series of different elements of research. And as John said recently, I was fortunate enough to be able to give a TEDx presentation where I talked about what we learned from plane crash theory, and I'll be talking about that again today. And then we're going to talk about cognitive development within children. We're going to talk about tribalism. We're going to talk about the hot-cold empathy gap, confirmation bias, the psychology of inequality, developing cognitive and emotional empathy, and then we're going to talk about the psychology of belonging. And of course, we're going to wrap that into the theme of alpine mountain goats. And if that sounds a little bit off the wall to you, probably accurate, but I hope that as we spend a bit of time this morning, you'll begin to see why it is that these researchers actually, when we look at them, tell us quite a few things that we can take into our schools. And as I present, I'm going to share with you the information that I've taken and where you can find it. So feel free to jot those down. So I'm going to start by talking about plane crash theory, and this concept was talked about by Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers, which I think came out in the late, I think it was 2008 or 2009. And the reason that it's important to us is because plane crash theory actually talks to us about elements that cause a plane crash, which are not what you might expect. So for most of us, when we think about why a plane might actually crash, we think about catastrophic events. So we think about a wing falling off or the engines catch on fire, because most of the connections that we have with plane crashes are these catastrophic events, an explosion, some sort of fire, etc., etc. But the truth is that certainly for most plane crashes, that's not the case. There's a series of events that actually culminate in the crash itself. And those events are things that are easily preventable in many cases. They're understandable, and yet they still cause an enormous loss of life and are shocking. So I'm going to share the details of two of these, which Gladwell talks about. So first of all, he talks about Avianca Flight 052. And this flight was flying from Bogota to New York, and it was in 1990. And it was crewed by a very experienced crew. So the captain was 51 years old. He had close to 2,500 hours of flying time. He had nearly 500 hours of night flying, and they were flying in the evening. His first officer had close to 2,000 hours. So we're talking about highly experienced pilots. Now, there was bad weather when they arrived in the New York area, but the flight had been completely uneventful. And when they got to New York, they were put into a series of holding patterns. You can see the map on the left-hand side of the screen. They were actually asked to delayed from landing several times. And as you read the report on the crash, you begin to realize that both the captain and the first officer knew for a considerable period of time that they were losing fuel, and that they were losing fuel fairly significantly. And Gladwell in his book actually outlines the entire conversation that took place. The challenge that they faced was one of communication. So the first officer, a gentleman named Maurizio Klotz, was the individual who was actually communicating with the air traffic control. And apparently, the air traffic control is known in New York for two things. Firstly, they're known to be one of the most efficient air traffic controllers in the world, as you might expect. And secondly, some of the rudest individuals to try and land planes. And so the Colombian air crew who were flying in actually attempted to communicate to the air traffic control that they had problems on several occasions. In fact, on 3 separate occasions, they told air traffic control, "We are running out of fuel." But the reality is that by their very nature, the longer a plane flies, the less fuel it has. And so the air traffic controllers are trained to listen for keywords. And the key word that was missing was the word emergency. At no point, no matter how many times they communicated, did the first officer say, "We have an emergency." And as a result of that, the plane circled until it could no longer land, and crashed about 20 miles short of the runway in actual fact. And if you listen to the transcript with this information in your head, you hear two things. First of all, you hear a captain saying to his first officer, "Please tell them we have an emergency. Please tell them we are running out of fuel." And you have a first officer then attempting to communicate with air traffic control, saying to them what he believed was, "We have a problem," which was, "We are running out of fuel." And at the same time, you have an air traffic control system listening for keywords like emergency and not hearing them, and as a result, the plane went down. Fascinatingly enough, one of the last communications between the first officer and the captain said to the first officer, "Did you tell them we're running out of fuel?" And his response was, "I did." And so the captain said, "What did they say?" And he said, "I don't know. I think they're angry at me. So I'm not quite sure what to say." Really interesting to me that a lack of communication could cause such a catastrophic event. And we might normally say, well, this is, that's perhaps a one-off, Adam. But the reality is, if you actually look at plane crash theory, there are many, many more examples. And not just communication. So culture also comes into it. And the second example that Gladwell gives is Korean Air Flight 801, which was flying from Seoul to Guam in 1997. And when you fly into Guam, the airport is not on a natural flight path. And so because it's difficult to navigate, there is a glide scope. So glide scope is basically a light, refractive light that pilots see, and they fly into that glide scope and then turn at the last minute when they see the airport. And Korean Air Flight 801 were flying in really bad weather. So the weather was extremely poor that evening. And the glide scope was actually not operating on that day. And both the captain and the first officer had been told before they had left that the glide scope was not going to be working. Now, in this situation, it was slightly different. Extraordinarily experienced captain. So he had more than 9,000 flight hours. He had over 3,000 hours on the plane that he was flying. His first officer had over 4,000 hours. And they actually had an engineer in the cockpit as well who had over 12,000 flying hours. So the three individuals flying the plane were extraordinarily experienced. And they were flying in conditions that, even though they were difficult, were known to them. They were very comfortable. In fact, the captain recently had received a safety award for managing planes well. Now, the situation here was slightly different because the captain had weather instead of going around it. And both the first officer, who was significantly junior to the captain, and the engineer, attempted to communicate with the captain. The problem is that in Korea, there's a really strong, you see a cultural hierarchy in languages. You see different ways of speaking. So for example, in this particular case, the first officer would never say to the captain, because culturally it would be inappropriate, "I think you're making a mistake," or "I don't think we should fly through the weather." And so when you read the actual transcript analysis of this particular incident, what you see is subtle hints from people in the cockpit. And so rather than saying, we're making a mistake here, we're not headed in the right direction, the first officer said things like, aren't you glad that we have radar on a night like tonight? Trying to get the captain to check the radar to see that he was not actually flying the plane in the right direction. And a series of subtleties or subtle comments, even when the first officer believed that the plane was going to go down. The cultural understanding of language that the first officer had was so strong that even when he thought his life was in danger, he wouldn't break it and say, "You're going to kill us all unless you pay attention to what's going on." And as a result, the plane flew into a mountainside 3 miles off course from the airport. And interestingly enough, when you look at the air traffic control conversations with Korean Air Flight, and air traffic control in Guam, and as I'm sure you can imagine, Guam is a developing country, did not have the confidence to say to a captain with 9,000 hours of flying, you don't appear to be in line here. And so again, a complete breakdown of communication. And when you look at these things, the reality is what we see is a drip feed of information. So there's a reason that the captain wasn't perhaps as alert as he might have been. He had in getting him to the airport on time, so he was rushed and a little bit frazzled when he actually got there. The weather was really bad. The glide scope was not operating. The people in the cockpit with him were not being very blunt with their communications. And so we see that trickle effect that I was talking about, multiple small percolations of problems that then result in a catastrophic event. So why is this important for our conversation today? Well, because in schools, we often see the same thing. So as we are used to seeing on the media catastrophic events in school that we remember. So if you ask people about school safety, they're going to talk about the Columbines of this world. But the reality is those of us who are in it understand it's far more complex and far more subtle than that. And we're going to talk today a little about some of those events that cause catastrophic events in schools. In order to do that, we're going to start with cognitive development. So the teachers amongst you will be aware of this, and I appreciate your patience as we run through this really quickly. So Piaget's stages of development. So we understand that, and for today, we're going to talk specifically about the concrete operational and the formal operational stage. So a concrete operational has to be something that is physical. It has to be something that is concrete to the student or child. And the formal operation, when we move from adolescence into adulthood, we begin to see a little bit more abstract thought and understanding. And it's really important that we consider these two different groups because they actually have a lot to do with the cultural makeup of schools. And if we want to understand how the right culture in our schools, then we have to understand how students develop culture. So in order to do that, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about tribalism. So in recent years, tribalism, the word tribe and tribalism has actually had a negative press, but the reality is the concept behind tribalism is actually a very positive one. It's the concept of us attempting to link into others around us. And as human beings, it's something that we've always done, obviously. Our first understanding of tribalisms goes back to the very beginning of mankind, where settlers would cluster together in groups or tribes in order to protect each other. Because if there's a small group, then we can protect our settlement far easier. Now, the reason this is important in schools and in education is that one of the most significant moves for a child as they move into adolescence is that they begin to look for a new tribe or a new group to belong to. And the reason for that is that for all of us as humans, our first tribe is our family. And regardless of that, that is our strongest, as a human being, that's our strongest connection. Regardless of whether or not the family is well functioning, it doesn't matter what the family makeup is, it doesn't matter if there's two parents or one, it doesn't matter the gender of the parents, it doesn't matter if there are siblings, it doesn't matter if it's an extended family. A human being's first tribe is their family. And as students move from roughly from the ages of about 10 until the age of 15 or so, move away from and for some of you it's on the way shortly, I would imagine, but children begin to move away from their family as being the first tribe, and they seek a new group. And because they're in school, most of them seek that group in school, as you might expect. And so we see different clusters or groups of individuals. And first of all, it might be students in a class. So it might be that I become friends with, in first or second grade, with those students who are sitting around me in class because they're the ones that I really meet with. But as students grow older, they begin to cluster in different groups. So maybe they're part of an athletic team, or maybe they're part of a dance team, or maybe they're part of the scouting movement, or maybe they're involved in theatre or drama. And we see students begin to connect with different tribes. Now, one of the mistakes that we make is that for some reasons that are a little bit unclear, but really come initially from media. Some people believe that there are students who don't find a tribe. So we talk about the outliers, or those lone wolf students who don't find a tribe. The reality is all students find a tribe. We just don't know which ones some connect to, because they connect in different ways. And we're going to talk a little bit later in the presentation what social media has done to that in terms of the challenges that causes. But rest assured, everybody finds a tribe. Now, some students will stay in their family tribe much longer. If they have a well-connected, strong family, they will stay in that tribe for longer. And for many students, they will actually be a member of multiple tribes. So in other words, they have this network of groups and friends that they're connected with. The reality is there is one home group and one home tribe. And as professionals who are working with students, we need to be aware of that, because the disruption of a singular tribe becomes quite important when you're trying to develop a culture. In other words, it's very healthy for schools to have a lot of different activities for students to be involved in, but each of those activities has to have a really strong connection with the school itself. So that if I, as Adam, are involved in marching band, and I'm involved in the tennis team, and I'm a member of the school, that I realize the school, and that I have a couple of subsets within that, as opposed to students believing, actually, my primary tribe is the tennis team, and then after that, the school. Because if students feel that way, they change their behavior. And by the way, we see this in leadership. So Seth Godin's book, Tribes, is an excellent book, and I would advise you to take a look at that if I were you, particularly if you're looking at educational leadership, or any kind of leadership for that matter, because it talks about tribalism and culture. It talks about not just the groups that we belong to, but the culture that is established by those groups. And that's really important. So the reason why it's important is because of the next piece of research that I'm talking to you, which is about the hot-cold empathy gap. And I put here that it's not just for students, it's really important for adults in actual fact as well. We're going to talk about it from a student perspective today, but the hot cold empathy gap is a significant issue for adults as well. And you can find there's some really good podcasts information here, but Hidden Brain has a great podcast called In the Heat of the Moment, which talks about the hot cold empathy gap. So let's talk about what that concept is. So the hot cold empathy gap is the difference between what we say we will do when we're out of a situation and what we really do when we're in it. Okay, so as human beings, we often in a cold state, in other words, when we're not directly or emotionally involved in something, when we're asked how we would behave, we let somebody know, well, I would do A, B, C, and D. And then when we're in the situation, we behave very differently. So those of you who have been in law enforcement, for example, who have been in highly stressful situations, you realize the benefits of your training in order to be able to deal with that in a professional way. Because the average lay person who is very comfortable saying, well, of course, I wouldn't have reacted like that, has little understanding of the hot cold empathy gap. When a human being is under pressure, they make decisions that they would not normally make, and more importantly, that they would not believe they would make. And for children, it's the same, but it's even magnified. And so there's some great research out there about this. So there's really good research. There was a research done in the university where people were asked to put their arm up to the elbow into iced water and leave it in there for a certain amount of time in order to receive a monetary gain. And it wasn't a lot of money, but they had to leave their arm in the ice water for, I don't know, 3 minutes or whatever, and they were going to get $3 or whatever. And of course, yes, I can do that. That's not a problem. They plunged their arm into the water and realized that that is not an easy proposition at all. And so the weak amongst them didn't last the 3 minutes because it was highly painful if you're not used to doing that. And so they withdraw their hand. If you then ask them 10 minutes later, would you like to do it again? Their response is actually, yes, I will, because I know I can do it this time. And they forget immediately the pain that was involved and the difficulty that they had in actually keeping their arms in the ice water. And so again, they plunge their arms in, and as you might expect, again, they don't last the 3 minutes. And it's because there's this hot, cold empathy gap. If you asked them when their hand was in the water just before they gave up, if they thought that this was a good idea and should they do it again, their answer would clearly have been no. But when you ask them after their arms warmed up again and the blood's flowing again, then they believe they can. And there's example after example of people reacting that way. One last example I'll give you was a recent piece of research that was done where a group of professionals were asked how they would react to inappropriate questions in an interview. And so they were asked, how would you, if somebody asked you an explicit, an explicit question at interview, and they weren't wildly inappropriate, but it was something about, how would you feel about dating somebody at work, or do you think it's appropriate to wear very tight-fitting clothes, or for us to suggest that you do? I mean, it was fairly inappropriate. And the people who were applying for the jobs were female in this particular case. And all of them said, I think it was about 70% of them said, look, if I was asked a question like that at interview, I'd say to them, I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think it's appropriate for you to ask me who I'm going to date, in an interview. I mean, you just can't. A subset of that group were then subsequently, 12 months later, invited to apply for jobs. And they did apply for, obviously, this fictitious job. And in the interview were asked several of the questions that a year before they had said they would never answer. And it's interesting because 70% said in their cold state they would be offended and would not answer. And out of all of them, only one person didn't answer the question. And only one other person at the end of the interview said, I think that question was inappropriate. And what we gain from this is it doesn't have to be violent pressure. Just the understanding that I'm trying to get a job, I want to do well, is enough to have us behave in ways that we might not normally behave. This is really important for us. So if you add the hot, cold empathy gap to the plane crash theory that we just talked about. Just think about this. You could do all the training you want to with the Korean pilots, saying to them, look, you have to be able to speak to the captain in an aggressive way if you believe there's a problem. And when they're at home in their professional development, of course they say they will do that. But when they're in a plane flying, it's a different thing, because the captain's got more than 9,000 hours and he's my superior, and I'm not supposed to say those things. And so changing that culture so that somebody actually does communicate effectively is very difficult. Now, in addition to the hot cold empathy gap, which for students is very big. So in other words, if you say to a student, are you likely to go to this party and behave badly? What if somebody offers you a drink, if somebody offers you drugs, or if somebody says they're going to hurt somebody, are you likely to say something about it? In their cold moments, they'll say yes, of course they will. But in the hot moments, when they're there at that party, when the other members of the soccer team or the dance team are saying, oh, go on, it's going to be okay, or then it's much more difficult for them. And so it's important for us as adults to set up a culture and a community, a tribal system that gets them to understand that they have support when they need to make those difficult decisions. And there's obviously a reason for that. And that's because within tribes, there's cultural bias. And obviously, I don't need to talk to you about cultural bias. We've been listening to it for many years now, particularly politically over the last few years. But the reality is that most bias is unconscious, and some of you will have seen some of my research before. So those of you who have seen this, the next couple of slides, I apologize if you've seen it before. But schema is everything. We don't see things the way they are. We see them the way we are, right? And so we know that for adolescents, this is even more important. So let me take you back to the slide just a few minutes ago where we talked about concrete developmental stages. So you've got a student who's 7 to 11 years old, who's a member of a tribe, maybe for the first time away from their family. They've got their friends away from their family. When their parents say to them, actually, I think that Adam's a bad influence, the student immediately reacts because tribally they're already connected, and because they have a blind spot to the negatives of an individual. And it's not until students get through that concrete developmental stage that they begin to see that there's a lot of gray area in life rather than just black and white. And if you want confirmation of that, watch any Disney movie that you'd like to. The baddies are really bad and the goodies are really good. And we know in life that that's not quite right. But the reality is, in a Disney movie, students are going to connect. Why? Because they're at that concrete stage. And if you have somebody in a Disney movie who's supposed to be a baddie and they do great things, the student becomes confused. The child becomes confused. The movie is more difficult for them to understand because that's not concrete. You're either good or you're bad. So imagine what that looks like now when we're in schools and somebody within your tribe is suggesting we do something wrong, or somebody within your tribe or your group says something bad about somebody else, or that they're going to hurt somebody else, or that something's going to happen. At that point, we've now got a young person who's got a real dilemma on their hands, because they're strongly connected to this new tribe, even though this new tribe may be a group of students who have come together because they don't fit into any other tribe, right? Maybe they don't fit into any other group. They come together, and this student, number one, is unlikely, they're going to have a blind spot, they're going to be unlikely to see the negative in their friends. Number two, they're going to want to associate with them. And so therefore, there's going to be this culture that it's not that bad. He or she is not that bad, right? Yes, these parties happen, but we don't do those things when we're at the party, right? So the student justifies within their own minds that it's going to be okay. Again, go back to plane crash theory. The plane was literally running out of fuel, and yet they didn't say we have an emergency, right? They didn't, and I, in my cold state, I'm thinking into myself, I would be standing up, screaming into the radio that's what would happen. Because we forget the power of that hot, cold empathy and the idea that culture makes a difference. A couple of resources here. Blind Spots, fantastic book, worth reading, about hidden biases of good people. And it really is very, very good. And then Whistling Vivaldi, some of you will have seen that before. So we're going to take a break just for a minute now, and we're going to do a couple of exercises. And again, some of you have heard me speak, may have seen a couple of these before. But what I want to do now is just to show you what I mean when I talk about blind spots, when I talk about us interpreting things the wrong way. So I'm going to start with some visual cues. So here's the first visual cue. So take a look. Fairly straightforward photograph, okay? I think when you look at it, we believe that we understand it quite well. We make assumptions, right, about the picture until we're given more information about the picture, which is that there is no lake in the photograph, and that if you actually tilt your head to the right, you'll see that the tree is actually laying on its side, and the gentleman is laying on the tree. And what you think is land really are the tree roots, which have been ripped out of the ground, right? So I'm going to just go back and show you that again. There's the original picture. When you show it to people, we make a series of assumptions, right? This is a man who's leaning against the tree. There's water there, because our schema tells us that's what it's supposed to be like. And it's not until we tilt our head. And then when you go back and look at it, you realize it couldn't have been reflections. Those trees wouldn't have been looking like that if they were reflected in the water. But there's a reason why, because we know that trees grow up. So if trees grow up, we know where the sky should be. If the sky should be there, then this extra space on the right-hand side of the picture has to be water. It's the only explanation we have. So let me give you another one. So I'm going to give you a minute or so to think about this one. So which card or cards should you turn over if I said to you, you need to prove to me that if there's an even number on one face, then the opposite face is blue? All right. So I'm just going to give you a minute to think through this. Okay, so the answer is that you would need to turn over the card number 6, or you would need to turn over the yellow card. And lots of people get this wrong, and they get it wrong because of some assumptions that we make. And the assumptions that we make, the first assumption that we make is that all cards are either blue or yellow, right? But of course, that's not necessarily true. We don't know that. There could be all sorts of colors. We can only see blue and yellow. And so even though in our mind, we automatically assume that. And then secondly, we need to check to see whether or not the blue will always be matched with the even numbers. And so in order to do that, if we take the first example of number 7, if we turn number 7 over and it's blue, that doesn't mean that blue numbers aren't linked with even cards, right? But in our mind, we're thinking, well, if 7 is odd, 7 should be yellow, because immediately we jump to the conclusion that because we've got 2 colors and 2 numbers. And so a simple mathematical equation, there's dozens of them you can find on the internet, where we make assumptions based upon information that's not true. And the reason why is that there's some information that we're not given. It's because you actually need a little bit more information in this particular answer. The next one is one of my favorites, and people will have seen this before. So A and B, and I'm just letting you know that A, the color of gray on the A part is the same color as the color of gray on the B part. And it's at this point where I see people on my camera saying, okay, he's lost the plot. That's not true. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your thumb and I want you to give me a big thumbs up. I want you to turn it sideways and please put it across the middle of the A and B diagram. And then you'll see that in actual fact, the two grays are the same color. And there's a reason why. The reason why we don't think it's the same color is because we're looking at the light around it and we're looking at where the shadow is, and our minds are telling us that this particular part is lighter because there's light involved in that. And it's not until you actually put something across the middle, because it's the middle is where the light refraction is, that you can see that actually the grays are the same color. And I love this one because even when I do this live with people, after you've shown people they're the same color, they will still look at it and say, you know, they're not the same color. There has to be something wrong here, right? It's because our schema, it's because our cultural understanding tells us certain things. And as a result of this, we make poor decisions. Now, remember that I've said to you that everything that we've done so far is magnified even further with children, because they don't understand the nuances. And so when I say to you that these are the same color, right? Even though you know it's an optical illusion, to you, it's not a differing reality. But to students it is, because if you're in the concrete developmental stage, you can't put yourself in the eyes of others. And what that does is that causes us not to see where the problems are. In other words, again, going back to the plane theory, little things, bad weather, glide scope not working, cultural problems, we don't add that up to think the end result might be catastrophic. And we see examples of that in real life, right? So what are we most afraid of? Well, we're terrified. I don't know about you, but I'm terrified of lions and sharks. I don't fancy either one of those too near me. The reality is, I know logically that mosquitoes kill more than 1 million people every year. You know, and you're more likely to, I can't remember what it is, to have a coconut fall on your head than to get bitten by a shark. But human beings, even though we know that, are so much more fearful of the catastrophic event, right? When we talk about supportive schools, we fear the catastrophic event, and we sometimes don't realize that those events are presupposed upon this percolating drip feed of misinformation or challenge. So we go back to our wonderful alpine mountain goats, who are going to feature a little bit later in the presentation. So where's the danger, right? So if I look at the picture on the top right-hand side, and I'm looking at an absolute sheer face, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, there's a baby alpine mountain goat, and I'm guessing this thing's going to go down soon. So I know where I think the danger is, because I'd much rather have them on the grassy hillside than on this sheer face of a dam, especially when they're young. The reality is, I've got to ask myself some other questions before I do that. So in order to do that, what I now want to do is to talk to you a little bit about how we overcome the miscommunication, the misinterpretation, and this cultural hierarchy, which involves, which is a good thing, by the way, for us and society, but which is everywhere. So if we're really going to keep our schools safe, and if we're really going to support our students, we need to be able to pay attention to a few things. And I'm going to suggest a couple of things to you this morning, which I think will make a huge difference. So the first one, and this is a significant challenge, I would say, in our society today, which is the psychology of inequality. So the psychology of inequality, and there's all sorts of research on this, and the Happiness Lab is another podcast. If you want to go and see, there's a great podcast about happiness. And it talks about the fact that in recent times, we have tended to have the predisposition of comparing ourselves to somebody else. And when you compare yourself to somebody else, when your happiness depends on somebody else, we've got a significant problem. So I'm going to jump down to the research on relative earnings. So there's great research done over the last 10 years where a group of people were asked, would you rather earn $50,000 a year? We'll pay you $50,000 a year. And by the way, $50,000 a year puts you in the top 1% of earners globally. So if we paid you would you rather earn $50,000 a year and the people who live in your neighborhood and around you only earn $35,000 a year? All right, so you earn 50,000, everybody who lives in your neighborhood earns 35,000. Or we'll pay you 100,000, we'll double the money, you'll get paid 100,000, but everybody living around you will earn 150,000. So you can either take half the money and be surrounded by a group or tribe that is less well off than you, or we'll double your money, but you're going to be at the bottom of the group or tribe. And it's fascinating that when asked, people choose 50% of their earnings about 50% of the time. So about half of the population would say, I would rather earn half the amount, but know that I'm at the top of my social group than earn twice as much money, be able to buy twice as many things, but actually be at the bottom of the group. And that's because the psychology of inequality. In other words, I'm going to base my own happiness, not necessarily based upon what's happening to me, but what's happening to the people around me, because that's how I compare myself. And there's lots of different examples of this. It's called the status hierarchy, and boarding a plane is the obvious example, right? So there's been some really good research done on plane rage. I didn't even know plane rage was a thing, but it is, I guess, when people get upset. And did you know that plane rage occurs 3 times, it's 3 times more likely to occur if the plane has a first class cabin and if people have to walk through the first class cabin before they take their seat? Because by the time they get to their seat, they're already frustrated because the first class people are already sipping champagne and they're going to get better food and I'm going to be pushed in like sardines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is it's just really that status is being held up in front of your eyes. And so you have a problem. Now, the good news is that with children, they don't understand this. And Keith Payne's book, The Broken Ladder, fantastic book, by the way. He talks about his lunchroom experience. And Keith Payne grew up quite poor. And he talks about the day that he went to lunch one day as a child. And there was a new lunch lady. And the lunch lady served him his food and said to him, that'll be $1.50. Well, Keith had never paid for his lunch before, and so he didn't understand what was going on. And that's when he realized for the first time, you know, there are some students who actually give money when they get their food, and he'd never had to. And so all of a sudden, people had to have a conversation with him about being on free lunches and reduced lunches. And as he talks about it, he said that changed his view of himself. It changed his view of other people, but more importantly than that, that changed how he saw himself compared to other people. So if he had to have free lunches and this group of kids did not have to have free lunches, they couldn't be in the same tribe because they were different. These students come from a different background, from a different culture. And he talks about the fact that that is one of the examples it gives, that changed how he saw himself compared to others. And this happens in schools all the time, right? It happens academically, it happens athletically, it happens in the classroom, it happens socially, et cetera, et cetera. As children begin to go through the concrete developmental understand the psychology of inequality, and some students deal with that better than others. So one of the challenges that we face is having to make sure that happiness cannot be in the hands of other people. In other words, we have to develop a community that says Adam feeling good about Adam cannot be about what other kids have or what other kids are doing. It has to be about Adam feeling good about himself. And it's difficult because as adults, we often see a psychology of inequality presented to us that may, by the way, not be accurate. All right. So the last part of this is the use of social media. It's absolutely fascinating to me how many people on social media work extraordinarily hard to present falsehoods about themselves, whether how happy they are, how content their family are, how loving and caring they are, because there's a need to present socially the fact that my life is good, and of course that puts additional pressure on other people who when you go on social media constantly think this is the case. And again, huge research on this, right? So if I'm a student and I do really well in one element of school, if I'm comparing it to myself, then I've done extraordinarily well. But if I'm comparing it to somebody else's success, I may not have been. So the perfect example of this, and again, this is from the Happiness Lab, is people who win silver medals at the Olympics. If you ever watched this, and I actually went back about a week ago as I was prepping for this to see if I could find medal ceremonies online, and you can actually find them, and they're really interesting. People who win silver medals at the Olympics often are unhappy. They're often really disappointed because they came really close to winning the gold. And so they're frustrated that they didn't win it. And if you look at how they present themselves compared to the person who won the bronze, often people who win the bronze are much happier because they were 2 places off. They weren't that close. And it wasn't as if something that was almost taken away from them. And the last piece of that is, well, the last way for us to see this is, so what if I'm swimming in the Olympic Games and I get to the final of the Olympics and I swim 2 seconds faster than I've ever swam in my life before and come last in the race? Do I feel successful or do I feel that I came last? And it's that whole concept of the psychology of inequality. If I'm judging myself on my own standards, then obviously I've never swum faster in my life. And that is the best performance, and it's the pinnacle of my career. If I'm judging myself based upon other people, I came last in the race. And so there's nothing for me to celebrate about. This is a real phenomenon that we see in schools. And it's one of those drip feed elements that we see. And so how do we translate this? There needs to be a space for everyone in your class. There needs to be a space, a successful space for everybody in the school and in the class. And by the way, it can be the simplest of things, right? Students caring for a plant, students having a cultural picture of the country that they came from, therapy dogs, or any caring of any sort of classroom animal is fantastic. Relationships with adults, somebody saying hi to them. Now, all of those elevate students in terms of their own social equality. The second thing that we need to be aware of is social media. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because I can't imagine that any one of you need me to share these sorts of graphs with you, other than to say, I would suggest to you that perhaps one of the greatest threats facing our young people today is the use of social media. Social media to bully other people, social media to feel good or bad about themselves. Students literally determining their own self-worth from the number of likes that they get on a post. Well, go back to that happiness theory. Imagine a student, basing their own self-confidence on whether or not people are willing to click like. And as a result, we see, and those of you who are on from school leadership or from law enforcement, we're seeing more and more risky behavior from students. We're seeing more and more poor decision-making in terms of the sharing of personal photographs, or bullying. Cyberbullying is through the roof comparatively. So I believe that schools that absolutely address social media and absolutely address self-confidence from a perspective of self, in other words, your happiness is not contingent on what somebody else is doing, is really important. And there are two key elements to this. And the first one is empathy. There are several programs which actually schools now are beginning to implement that will develop empathy in students. And there's two types of empathy that you need to be aware of. The first one is emotional empathy. So that's the empathy that you get when there's somebody close to you, somebody within your tribe. And that's because you feel close to them, right? So there's an automatic empathy. And we see this in a variety of ways. The most obvious is a parent, right? So we tend to be overly empathetic for our children. And so we have terms like helicopter parents and lawnmower parents, because they want to give the best to their child. They're fearful of so many things in terms of their own children. But the other empathy is perhaps even more important. It's cognitive empathy. And this is empathy with people outside of your tribe, but inside of your culture. In other words, you don't feel an emotional connection to this person, but you understand how they feel because maybe you felt the same way, or you've been taught to understand how they feel. And this cognitive empathy is really important for young children. Because when we develop cognitive empathy within a group, what we do is we begin to break down the cultural hierarchy, and we begin to break down the communication gaps. So in other words, we go back to what I said a few moments ago. If the core culture is our school, we are part of our school. There's lots of different groups in our school, but we're all part of the same school. We're developing cognitive empathy, and students will then begin to have empathy for others. That's really important when it comes to reporting. It's really important that somebody understands that Adam's having a bad time, or Adam said some things that he might consider doing, etc., etc. The second element, which is really important, is the psychology of belonging. And again, those of you who know me knew that there was going to have to be a picture of Bulldog somewhere in this presentation. So here it is. Young children don't realize they don't belong. And again, it's just some marvelous stuff on YouTube. In the natural world, there are groups that don't understand that they don't belong. So you've got whatever it is, groups of sheep raising a duckling or whatever, something crazy. Because that sense of belonging doesn't actually have to come from being the same, all right? So if we develop healthy ecosystems, multiple tribes can exist together. And that has to be our goal in schools, is developing an ecosystem that lets children know everybody belongs, no matter how different you are. Now, the good news is when you're in the concrete developmental stage, the young children just have no clue, right? They just don't understand that they don't belong. It's not until they start to move through adolescence that they realize that they're too big, or they're too small, or they're not athletic enough, or they're not popular enough, et cetera, et cetera. And so taking the time to work to create a school-wide culture of belonging becomes really important, because the school-wide culture of belonging actually breaks down the barriers. So what did Korean Air do? Korean Air in 1998 actually went from an airline that had the highest rate of accident, went through a huge training phase for all of their pilots on communication and a sense of combined cultural belonging. Everybody's worth the same thing. Interestingly, for the last 10 years, Korean Airline is the safest airline on the planet. They continue to work aggressively on a sense of belonging. Everybody has the right to speak. And when I do speak, I don't do it to challenge culturally. I do it because I actually care about you. And if we can instill that in our students, we're in good shape. So that's the journey. And so all it remains now is for me to share with you what on earth this has to do with the Alpine Mountain goats. Well, because the alpine mountain goats is actually one of nature's best examples of communities that actually coexist and that come together well. And the reality is that over time, they have evolved to make sure that they take care of all of the needs that they have. They're actually safest when they're on the steepest rock faces. Why? Because they have no natural predators there. Nobody else can actually get there and can get to them. But within their culture, there are four completely distinct groups. There's adult males, there's female groups, there's groups of young, and then there's mixed groups. And they actually don't live together. They come together at different times. So the only time that you see mixed sex groups over a long period of time is when they mate. There's a linear dominance. So a hierarchy exists. They know their place, but at the same time, they take care of their own. So that's interesting, right? Because at a certain time of the year, dominant males will challenge another male in order for them to be able to mate. But then as soon as that mating season is done between December and January, those dominant males then care for the other males. The culture of their tribe says a community and then within that we have these subsets. And in order for them to do that, they're a really good example of how we can look at designing our schools, designing our interactions so that our students feel a huge sense of culture and community, but at the same time can individually be defined by themselves. So just thank you, first of all, for spending a little bit of time and for me to be able to share with you a little bit of this information. I have sent to John a PDF of the presentation. If you would like that, you can contact him or I'd be happy to share that with you. Hopefully this will allow you to reflect and to consider some of the programs that you might have in your schools. Because I would suggest to you that taking the time for us to remember how good cultures work would be and could be a very good use of our time. So with that, I'm going to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holden. Excellent presentation. Can't think of a better way to kick off our conference. Research just in your face. That was phenomenal. Thank you so much. Guys, we're going to release you to go to your next breakout sessions. If you have any problems or didn't get links, let me know. Let Jim Green know. Any problems at all throughout the week, let us know. Thank you guys so much for being here, and good luck with the rest of the week. Thank you so much.